Welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you for tuning in. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and bringing you these tales. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can pay their living expenses and continue creating for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. To the Kalen, the sprawling orbital scrapyard was entirely silent. To Elias, it was a deafening symphony of decaying metal, groaning under the immense artificial gravity of the station. But beneath the screech of tearing hulls and the heavy hum of magnetic cranes, there was something else, a rhythm, a deep, impossible heartbeat thudding against the base of his skull, coming from a colossal hunk of scorched iron that every sensory grid in the sector claimed was completely dead. Elias Buckley was 42 years old, and for most of his adult life, he had listened to stones and steel cry in the absolute dark. As an acoustic harmonic engineer contracted out to the desolate fringe asteroid mines, his primary duty was to find microscopic structural weaknesses long before they became explosive catastrophes. He did not rely on standard visual scanners. Instead, a thick surgical steel port was fused directly into his mastoid bone, connecting a heavy-duty bone conduction array straight to his auditory nerve. Because of this crude but highly effective cybernetic modification, he could literally hear the microfractures forming in a pressure bulkhead, the invisible stress lines shifting in titanium struts, and the metallic weeping of a foundational support structure that was about to fail. Currently, he stood shivering on the greasy, frost-covered deck of a decommissioned Kalen dreadnought, which was serving as a makeshift auction house. The Kalen were massive, chitinous beings who communicated purely through highly concentrated microwave bursts. To human ears, they made no sound at all, save for the heavy, unnerving clicking of their razor-sharp segmented legs against the floor grating. The vast, cavernous cargo bay was packed wall-to-wall with representatives from various alien mining conglomerates, all ruthlessly bidding on planetary excavators and orbital defense arrays. Among these towering titans of interplanetary industry, Elias was merely a ghost. He was just a frail, fleshy number in the registry, completely ignored and openly despised by the corporate giants who viewed humanity as nothing more than cheap, expendable labor meant to be ground into dust, seeking refuge from the crushing crowd. Elias wandered away from the brightly lit main bidding platforms, drifting steadily toward the outer fringes of the scrapyard where the genuinely worthless lots were unceremoniously dumped. There, sitting heavily in the cold shadows of shattered artillery cannons, was Lot 739, designated on the auction manifest simply as the Black Zenith. It was not a majestic decommissioned starship, but rather a colossal spatial orientation engine core. It was a monolithic block of pitch-black, unknown alloy, rising over 3 stories high, its surface brutally scarred and pitted by what appeared to be immense, localized heat. The Kalen auctioneers had officially labeled it as completely burned out and unrecoverable, essentially a dead star of heavy, useless metal, fit only to be violently melted down into industrial slag. As Elias walked past the looming shadow of the massive core, a sudden, sharp spike of pressure hit the base of his skull. He stopped dead in his tracks. He closed his eyes, his grease-stained fingers slowly tuning the analog dial on his neural implant collar. It was an infrasound vibration, incredibly subtle, slipping far under the threshold of normal biological hearing. Thump, thump, thump. A rhythmic, perfectly cyclical pulse transmitting straight into his cerebral cortex. He glanced up nervously at the sophisticated Kalen sensory drones hovering silently above him. Their indicator lights remained a flat, passive blue. The Kalen digital scanners were infinitely more advanced than any human technology, but they were strictly calibrated for absolute mechanical diagnostics. They were intentionally designed to aggressively filter out and ignore anything categorized as organic noise. Elias stepped closer, driven by a morbid curiosity, pressing his bare palm against the freezing, jagged surface of the black Zenith. The vibration shuddered forcefully through his wrist, traveling up his arm and resonating deeply within his jawbone. A profound contradiction gnawed viciously at his seasoned engineering instincts. A dead, burned-out engine core could not possibly generate an internal pulse this structurally complex. Furthermore, the deafening background roar of the scrapyard, the grinding steel gears, the heavy clicking footsteps of the Kalen, none of it was echoing off the massive structure in front of him. The black Zenith was not reflecting ambient sound. It was actively absorbing it. Every single decibel of chaotic noise that hit the pitch-black surface was being swallowed whole, feeding that impossible, hidden heartbeat buried deep within the dark metal. The electronic chime, signaling the imminent end of the auction, soon echoed throughout the massive bay. Lot 739 was merely seconds away from being formally liquidated for scrap weight. Elias looked down at his cracked personal terminal. His account held the exact sum of his life savings. 10 grueling years of bleeding his ears out in the frozen asteroid belts, carefully saved up for a one-way ticket back to the safer inner colonies. His thumb hovered trembling over the biometric confirmation scanner. If his instincts were wrong, he would be completely financially ruined, stranded in this sector forever. The pulse thumped against his skull once again, feeling almost like a desperate, ancient plea, biting the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper. Elias locked his bid in. He spent every single credit he owned to purchase the Black Zenith for an absolute rock-bottom price just before the timer hit zero. All around him, the towering Kalen merchants paused their invisible microwave chatter. Though he could not hear their words, he could read their physical posturing perfectly. Their sharp mandibles twitched in unified, silent mockery, laughing mercilessly at the foolish human who had just traded a decade of his life for a mountain of dead, useless iron. The rusted tow cable snapped taut, groaning in protest as the heavy magnetic winches dragged the monolithic object into the cramped confines of the orbital workshop. Elias's sanctuary, on the outer rim of the transit hub, was a suffocatingly tight space, smelling permanently of ozone, burnt flux, and stale recycled oxygen. The massive black structure barely cleared the reinforced blast doors, its imposing mass dominating the entire room and leaving only a narrow walkway against the bulkheads. The air in the room felt instantly heavier, weighed down by the sheer, inexplicable density of the alien artifact. Elias wasted no time. He hauled out his most expensive diagnostic rigs, thick power cables snaking across the grated floor like mechanical vines. He clamped a pair of high-frequency industrial ultrasonic emitters directly onto the pitch-black alloy and powered up the primary scanning console. The heavy monitors flickered to life, projecting a wireframe grid that should have mapped the internal density of the engine core. Instead, the screens violently distorted. The data streams cascaded into a mess of chaotic static before flatlining into absolute black. The system error codes flashed repeatedly, indicating not a solid mass, but an infinite, immeasurable void. Frustrated, he swapped to a high-grade laser diffractometer. The intense crimson beam struck the dark hull and simply vanished. There was no scatter, no reflection, and no thermal bloom. The alien material swallowed the focused light just as greedily as it swallowed ambient noise. He stepped back, wiping industrial grease from his forehead. The digital tools were entirely useless against something that actively defied the standard laws of modern physics. Leaning against his cluttered workbench, Elias remembered the gruff voice of his late mentor, an old, orbital rigger who always claimed that a digital screen could lie, but a physical vibration never would. abandoning the sophisticated diagnostic equipment. Elias reached under his desk and pulled out a battered, velvet-lined wooden case. Inside lay a complete set of beryllium copper tuning forks, perfectly preserved, alongside a vintage, 21st century medical stethoscope. It was ancient, primitive technology, relying entirely on the raw, uncorrupted physics of acoustic impedance and wave propagation through physical matter. He fitted the cold rubber earpieces into his ears and pressed the heavy chest piece firmly against the alien metal. With his other hand, he struck a low-frequency tuning fork against the heel of his heavy boot and touched its vibrating base to the hull. A pure, resonant note sang out, traveling through the thick alloy. Elias closed his eyes, mapping the physical echo in his mind. He moved the stethoscope a few inches to the right, struck a different fork, and listened again. He worked continuously for 18 agonizing hours. The cramped workshop grew stiflingly hot. Sweat stung his eyes, and his fingers cramped painfully from repeatedly striking the metal alloys. But he refused to stop. He used a piece of white chalk to mark the surface, drawing a sprawling, chaotic web of lines and intersecting circles over the dark metal. He was hunting for the anomalies, and slowly, he found them. There were acoustic dead zones scattered irregularly across the hull, specific points where the vibrations did not bounce back at all. When he finally stepped back to observe the chalk marks, the seemingly random dead zones formed a precise, intricate geometric constellation. It was a lock mechanism, completely invisible to visual or biometric scans. It did not require a security cipher, a thumbprint, or a retinal flash. It demanded a harmony. The mechanism was a complex acoustic puzzle that could only be unsealed by a perfectly synchronized sequence of specific chords. His hands shaking from deep physical exhaustion and too much synthetic caffeine. Elias dragged 3 heavy mechanical harmonic oscillators to the base of the monolith. These were crude, piston-driven machines designed to shake loose, rusted mining drill bits. But they were capable of generating raw, powerful acoustic waves. He carefully calibrated their analog dials, matching the mechanical frequencies to the specific dead zones he had mapped with his tuning forks. He took a deep breath, engaged the safety overrides, and slammed the activation levers forward simultaneously. The oscillators roared to life, driving a heavy, overlapping triad of mechanical chords straight into the heart of the geometric lock. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the entire surface of the black monolith shuddered violently. The rock-solid, heat-scarred alloy suddenly lost its molecular cohesion. It rippled like dark water disturbed by a heavy stone, instantly liquefying into a substance resembling thick, black mercury. With a soft, hissing exhalation of pressurized gas, the liquid metal parted smoothly down the center, sliding away to reveal the hidden core. Elias killed the power to the oscillators. The deafening roar of the machines died away, replaced by a profound, reverent silence. He stepped cautiously toward the opening, peering into the impossible space inside. There were no scorched propulsion coils, no shattered fusion manifolds, and no signs of mechanical failure. The interior was a pristine, spherical vacuum chamber. Suspended in the dead center of this empty space floated a breathtakingly complex crystalline lattice. It was not glass or diamond, but something impossibly intricate, folding in on itself in sharp, geometric shapes. The entire structure was glowing faintly, pulsing with a soft, ethereal blue light that perfectly matched the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat he had heard back at the scrapyard. Mesmerized by the gentle, hypnotic throb of the light, Elias stepped over the threshold. He reached out his right hand, his fingers trembling slightly. Without thinking, he grabbed the thick fabric of his insulated work glove and pulled it off, letting it drop to the floor grating. He extended his bare hand into the vacuum chamber and gently brushed his fingertips against the cold, perfectly smooth facet of the glowing crystal. The instant his skin made contact, a massive acoustic shockwave detonated directly inside his mind. The force of it bypassed his cybernetic implant entirely, slamming into his natural eardrums. The sound folded, fractured, and reorganized itself. Utilizing the biological architecture of his human auditory system as a living translation matrix. The chaotic noise smoothed out into a resonant, booming voice, speaking flawlessly in his native tongue. "Greetings, engineer. I am what your crude linguistic parameters might translate as the architect," the voice echoed. Not within the physical confines of the room, but occupying the vast, empty spaces between Elias's thoughts. The tone was impossibly ancient, carrying the heavy, melancholic weight of dust and dead stars. "I am the digital echo of a Genesis civilization, a collective consciousness that faded into the cosmic background radiation, millions of years before the first single-celled organism crawled from the primordial oceans of your home world." Elias stumbled backward, his heavy boots hitting the solid metal desk behind him. He gasped for air, his chest heaving under his stained overalls. But he could not tear his widened eyes away from the floating crystalline lattice. The soft blue light pulsed faster now, flawlessly syncing with his own racing, terrified heart rate. "Why are you here?" Elias whispered aloud, the sound of his own voice trembling violently in the cramped, freezing workshop. "I am not merely here," the architect replied, its tone calm and terrifyingly omniscient. "I am the tether. I am the final anchor to a foundational truth that your current galactic rulers have systematically erased from all recorded history. Tell me, engineer of the fractured stones, what do you understand of the faster-than-light spatial slipstreams?" "They are natural tears in the fabric of spacetime," Elias recited numbly, repeating the fundamental astrophysics drummed into every orbital dock worker by the Alliance Council's educational mandates. "They are cosmic rivers. We just build the massive transit gates to ride the current. They are rare, highly unstable, and strictly regulated by the authorities for our own safety." A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the glowing lattice, carrying an unmistakable wave of profound, ancient sorrow directly into Elias's mind. "A monumental lie," the architect stated, the words striking Elias like physical blows to the chest. "The spatial slipstreams are not natural phenomena. They are the decaying, neglected arteries of an artificially constructed transit web, built by my people to unite the disparate corners of the galaxy. The network was designed to be infinite, accessible to every sentient mind, a boundless, frictionless ocean of free movement." The crystal flared brilliantly, projecting a massive, three-dimensional holographic star map directly into Elias's visual cortex. He saw the entire Milky Way, brilliantly illuminated by a densely woven, glowing web of billions of interconnected transit routes, stretching across the dark expanse like a thriving nervous system of pure light. Then, a dark, consuming shadow violently fell over the beautiful projection, severing the bright lines. "The Alliance Council did not discover the network," the entity continued, its voice dropping to a somber vibration. "They conquered it. Upon finding the primary control nexuses millennia ago, they intentionally fractured and choked 90% of the ancient infrastructure. They engineered an artificial scarcity, collapsing billions of stable routes until only a handful of easily heavily fortified pathways remained. By controlling these fabricated bottlenecks, they monopolize all interstellar trade, dictate the flow of essential survival resources, and maintain absolute, tyrannical power over emerging, lesser species like your own." Elias felt his stomach drop into a bottomless abyss. The grinding, inescapable poverty of his people, the crippling economic tariffs that kept humanity confined to dangerous, high-mortality asteroid mines, The relentless subjugation by the alien conglomerates. It was not the harsh reality of an unforgiving, chaotic universe. It was a deliberate, engineered starvation designed to break the spirit of any species that might challenge their supremacy. It was a carefully orchestrated prison. "And this," Elias stammered, gesturing weakly toward the glowing black monolith. "What is this machine?" "The Black Zenith is the master key," the architect declared, the blue light intensifying until it cast long, sharp shadows across the cluttered workshop. "It is the final, uncorrupted backup drive. Within my lattice lies the unadulterated source code, capable of repairing the broken cosmic weave. It can force a system-wide reboot, instantly reactivating the entire original spatial network and opening the doors of the galaxy to anyone, anywhere, without the need for the Council's oppressive transit gates." The sheer scale of the revelation threatened to completely crush Elias's sanity. He was a simple acoustic mechanic who listened to screaming metal. He was not a revolutionary. "But why did you wait? This core has been sitting in scrapyards and auction blocks for thousands of years. The Kalan, the Varathi, they possess technology far beyond anything humanity could ever dream of building. Why did you never speak to them?" "Because they could not speak to me," the entity replied simply. "When my creators designed the ultimate fail-safe mechanism, they recognized that highly advanced, digitized civilizations often lose their connection to the raw, biological universe. They built the activation sequence to respond only to a highly specific, organic harmonic resonance. The Kalan communicate in sterile, mathematical microwaves. The Varathi speak in synthesized telepathic clicks. Their machines scan for rigid data, not for the chaotic warmth of life." The breathtaking holographic projection dissolved, leaving only the pulsing crystal hanging in the void. The lock demanded a raw, physical vibration, the architect explained. Specifically, the precise vibrational amplitude generated by the biological vocal cords of a living entity, by pure, cosmic serendipity, the anatomical structure of the human larynx, the exact way air is forced through your cartilaginous folds, produces a sustained frequency that perfectly matches my base activation resonance. Your species is the only one in the known galaxy physically capable of singing the key. A cold, paralyzing terror washed over Elias. He stared blankly at his trembling, grease-stained hands. He was no longer just an ignored, invisible number in a massive corporate ledger. He was holding the most dangerous economic and political weapon in the entire universe. If the Alliance Council even suspected that the master key had been found, let alone that a lowly human possessed it, they would not negotiate. They would not send planetary police. They would immediately and mercilessly vaporize Earth, turning the blue oceans into clouds of radioactive ash and reducing every human colony in the sector to floating debris, just to guarantee that their lucrative lie remained safely buried in the dark forever. The immense, crushing weight of absolute responsibility settled heavily onto his tired shoulders. The connection between Elias and the ancient consciousness deepened, pulling taut across the vast emptiness of the void. In that brief fraction of a second of absolute synchronization, the glowing crystalline lattice flared intensely. It was a completely involuntary biological reaction to his touch. The monolith exhaled a hyper-concentrated pulse of pure quantum energy. The invisible wave possessed zero kinetic force. It was entirely harmless to biological life and completely silent to organic ears. But across the higher dimensional planes, it screamed with the fury of a dying star. The pulse ripped effortlessly through the local sector, bypassing the standard civilian sensory grids entirely. However, deep within the heavily fortified command citadels of the Alliance Council, located hundreds of light-years away, ancient and highly classified surveillance arrays suddenly awoke from their slumber. These silent, dusty monitors had been lying dormant for countless millennia. specifically calibrated to detect exactly one unique harmonic signature. The forbidden frequency had just violently registered on their screens. The reaction of the galactic authorities was merciless, coordinated, and terrifyingly swift. Less than 3 hours later, the constant, ambient mechanical hum of the outer transit hub abruptly died. The massive artificial gravity generators shuddered violently as severe power surges drained the main grid. Elias scrambled desperately to his narrow, frost-covered viewport and wiped away the condensation. The chaotic, bustling traffic of the orbital scrapyard, usually filled with thousands of independent freighters, was completely gone. In its place hung the terrifying, jagged silhouettes of Varathi stealth frigates and heavily armored Kalan dreadnoughts. They had decloaked in perfect, predatory unison, forming a suffocating, impenetrable blockade around the fragile outer rim. All local communication channels dissolved instantly into harsh, aggressive static. The Council forces had entirely severed the station from the rest of the known galaxy. Suddenly, the heavy analog console on Elias's cluttered workbench sparked violently. The blinding static cleared, forcefully replaced by an overriding transmission that bypassed all local security firewalls. A harsh, heavily synthesized voice, deeply characteristic of the Varathi High Command, filled the cramped, freezing room. "Attention! Human designated as Elias Buckley." The voice grated, cold, mechanical, and mathematically precise. "You have unknowingly purchased a Class 9 biological hazard during the recent liquidation cycle. Surrender the low-grade scrap metal immediately. A specialized containment team is currently docking at your sector. Comply with our directives, and your personal account will be instantly credited with exactly 5 million Universal Standard credits. Refuse this generous offer, and we will formally classify this entire station as a terminal infection zone and brutally purge it with concentrated plasma fire. 5 million credits. It was an astronomical amount of wealth, easily enough to buy a private terraformed moon in the core worlds. But Elias knew the horrifying truth behind the offer. They were absolutely terrified. The massive bribe was a desperate, panicked attempt to quietly retrieve their stolen cosmic key without causing a sector-wide panic. And the threat of annihilation was a 100% certainty. Elias did not reach for the transmission key. He did not say a single word in response. He was a dead man standing in a tomb, and he knew it. But if the towering council commanders thought he was just another terrified rat trapped in an inescapable cage, they were severely underestimating the desperate, violent ingenuity of a deep space asteroid miner. He turned his back on the comms array and grabbed his heavy industrial plasma cutter. He had less than 20 minutes before the armored containment team physically breached his reinforced blast doors. Elias began wildly tearing apart his own workshop. He ripped heavy, high-capacity diagnostic cables directly from the walls, desperately stripping the thick rubber insulation with his bare, bleeding hands. He needed a massive conductive conduit. Panting heavily, he dragged the thick, copper-weaved wires toward the floating, glowing crystal suspended inside the black Zenith. His desperate plan was pure, reckless madness. The entire outer transit hub was equipped with a massive, omnidirectional acoustic warning system. It was originally designed to blast deafening, station-wide collision alarms if a stray rogue asteroid threatened the structural integrity of the habitat. Those heavy-duty industrial speakers were wired directly into every single residential corridor, every commercial hangar, and every external armor plate of the station, working with frantic, adrenaline-fueled speed. Elias mercilessly spliced the raw communication feeds of the station's emergency warning grid directly into the conductive base of the ancient crystalline lattice. He was aggressively building the largest, most powerful amplifier in the entire history of the galactic quadrant. A violent, bone-rattling tremor suddenly shook the steel floorboards beneath his heavy boots. They had successfully breached the outer sector airlock. Elias could clearly hear the heavy, unified, rhythmic thud of Kalen's shock troops marching relentlessly down the narrow, metallic corridor leading to his door. He quickly reached into his battered tool belt and grabbed a heavy handful of high-frequency seismic detonators. These were highly dangerous explosive tools meant to safely crack dense granite deep within the asteroid mines. But right now, they were his absolute last line of physical defense. He slapped the heavy metal detonators onto the thin steel walls of the corridor just outside his workshop, hastily setting them to trigger on a strict proximity delay. As the heavy, clicking footsteps of the alien vanguard approached the critical threshold, Elias smashed his fist down on the remote activation switch. The cramped corridor immediately erupted into an invisible, terrifying storm of highly concentrated ultrasonic waves. The acoustic frequency was so violently high that it instantly shattered every ambient light bulb in the vicinity, plunging the hallway into darkness. But to the heavily armored Kalen troops, the trap was absolutely devastating. The intense, localized vibrations easily bypassed their thick, projectile-resistant chitin plating entirely. The high-frequency waves violently liquefied the delicate, highly sensitive microwave sensory organs buried beneath their armor. Terrible, high-pitched shrieks of pure agony echoed forcefully through the heavy steel walls as the vanguard completely collapsed, thrashing blindly and helplessly in the confined space. "Push forward immediately!" The Varathi commander roared angrily over the open local frequency, completely and callously ignoring the agonizing suffering of his own frontline troops. "Cut through the primary bulkhead now." The heavy, reinforced blast door to Elias's small workshop began to glow a vicious, blinding cherry red as a military-grade thermal lance ignited on the other side. Droplets of molten steel slag dripped heavily onto the floor grating, hissing violently as they hit the cold metal. His improvised, desperate acoustic traps had successfully bought him exactly 4 minutes of borrowed time. Elias retreated slowly to the dead center of the room, standing directly beneath the towering, pitch-black monolith. The tight workshop was rapidly filling with thick, acrid, suffocating smoke. He was entirely and completely trapped. There were no hidden escape pods beneath the floorboards, no secret ventilation shafts large enough for a human to crawl through, and absolutely no allied reinforcements coming to save him from the dark. The entire, overwhelming military might of the galaxy was bearing down heavily on his tiny, miserable corner of space. Yet, as he looked up at the steady, pulsing blue light of the architect, Elias felt an unnatural, profound sense of absolute clarity wash over his exhausted mind. He physically could not fight a heavily armed alien fleet. He could not outrun a cloaked stealth dreadnought, the only possible way to survive, the only conceivable way to ensure that humanity was not quietly and brutally erased from the historical ledger by tomorrow morning, was to violently rip the blindfold off the entire universe. He had to make the terrifying secret too loud, too massive, and too undeniably obvious to ever be contained by the Council again. The glowing, molten circle on his heavy blast door was almost complete. The ruthless hunters were confidently stepping into the final trap, completely unaware that the insignificant human rat was firmly holding the trigger to a cosmic bomb. The massive Varathi stealth frigates hovering outside did not wait for their boarding party to succeed. Following the brutal logic of total containment, the fleet commanders initiated a surgical orbital bombardment. Brilliant lances of superheated plasma pierced the absolute vacuum of space, carving flawlessly through the structural support pylons surrounding Elias's workshop. The habitation modules adjacent to his sector were violently sheared off from the main hub. The deafening screech of tearing titanium echoed through the deck plates as explosive depressurization instantly claimed the outer rings. Atmospheric processors shrieked in mechanical agony. The life support systems failed in rapid succession, and the precious, Breathable oxygen began violently venting out into the dark, freezing void. Inside the heavily reinforced workshop, the gravity generators stuttered and completely died. Loose tools, shattered glass, and droplets of Elias's own blood began to float weightlessly in the rapidly chilling air. He clamped his heavy magnetic boots firmly to the floor grating, fighting the chaotic zero-gravity environment. The glowing, molten circle on his primary blast door finally reached its terrifying completion. With a deafening, concussive boom, the heavy steel barrier was violently kicked inward. A heavily armored squad of Varathi executioners swarmed into the room. They were terrifying. Bipedal reptilians clad in active camouflage tactical gear, raising their heavy particle beam rifles directly at the lone human. They pulled their triggers without a single moment of hesitation. Elias did not flinch. He channeled a sharp, intense vocal hum directly through his clenched teeth, projecting a specific acoustic frequency straight into the heart of the black zenith. The ancient, crystalline lattice responded instantaneously. It recognized the frantic biological distress signal and unleashed a defensive protocol that defied modern military comprehension. A visible, rippling dome of hyper-compressed sound waves violently erupted from the core, forming a perfect, impenetrable sphere around Elias and the monolith. The incoming volley of lethal particle beams struck the invisible acoustic barrier and completely shattered. The sheer kinetic force of the solid sound waves caught the superheated energy bolts and violently reflected them back at the attackers. The vanguard of the execution squad was instantly vaporized by their own ricocheting weapons fire. The surviving soldiers scrambled desperately backward, firing wildly at the dome, but every single shot was effortlessly absorbed and deflected by the sheer, overwhelming density of the harmonic shield. The Varathi assault had been successfully halted, but Elias knew the shield was only a temporary tactical advantage. He was breathing heavily, his lungs burning as the ambient oxygen levels in the room dropped perilously low. Suddenly, the chaotic, aggressive static on his hacked communication terminal cleared completely. It was not the harsh, synthesized voice of the Varathi High Command this time. Instead, a smooth, highly refined, and surprisingly calm voice resonated through the speakers, utilizing a flawlessly modulated translation matrix. "Engineer Buckley, I suggest you stop holding your breath and listen to me very carefully," the voice stated. It carried the undeniable, arrogant cadence of the Kalan High aristocracy, a tone usually reserved for addressing planetary governors. "I am High Scholar Valen, serving aboard the primary dreadnought, currently attempting to murder you. For the last 70 years, I have deeply suspected that the Alliance Council has been actively suppressing the true cosmological history of our galaxy. The quantum pulse your artifact just emitted confirmed my life's work. I have intentionally sabotaged the fleet's communication firewalls and forcefully hardwired your local terminal directly into the pan-galactic broadcast relay. You have exactly 5 minutes of uninterrupted, universal broadcast time before the fleet technicians violently purge my override." Elias stared at the terminal in pure shock. A high-ranking enemy aristocrat had just handed him the ultimate megaphone. "Do not celebrate yet, human," the Kalan noble continued, his tone turning sharply grim. "The Council commanders are entirely panicked by your acoustic anomaly. They have officially abandoned the boarding action. The flagship is currently spooling up its primary antimatter cannons. They are going to completely vaporize this entire transit hub and a significant portion of the surrounding asteroid field, just to be absolutely certain your artifact is destroyed. Your impressive localized harmonic shield will absolutely not survive a direct, planetary-level antimatter strike." Death was no longer a vague possibility. It was a rapidly approaching, heavily armored certainty. The Kalan aristocrat had effectively given him the stage, but the curtains were already catching fire. Faced with absolute annihilation, a strange, profound calm washed completely over Elias. The frantic, Adrenaline-fueled panic drained entirely from his system. He turned his back on the terrified Varathi soldiers cowering outside his door and placed both of his hands firmly onto the glowing, floating crystal of the architect. "Did you hear him?" Elias asked quietly, his voice perfectly steady. "We have exactly 5 minutes of open air. I need you to initiate the master synchronization protocol for the entire spatial network. But before you open the gates, I need you to compress every single piece of historical data you possess regarding the Council's betrayal, their artificial scarcity, and their galactic enslavement. Attach all of that ancient data directly into the payload of the broadcast wave." "The data package is compiled and ready," the architect replied, its voice resonating with an ancient, terrifying majesty. "The frequency payload is primed for absolute universal dissemination. We merely require the biological activation key." Before Elias could draw the necessary breath, the main command frequency violently forced its way back through the Kalan noble's failing firewall. The furious, sneering voice of the fleet's supreme commander completely dominated the audio channel. "You miserable, filthy little ape," the commander spat, his voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered venom. "You actually thought you could fight a galactic empire with salvage and noise? Your species is nothing but a plague of noisy, insignificant scavengers crawling through our garbage. Humanity has absolutely no place in the grand history of this universe. You will die right here in the dark, and by tomorrow, your entire pathetic species will be completely erased from the cosmic registry." Elias stood tall within the center of the glowing acoustic shield. The heavy magnetic boots kept him anchored to the floor, but his spirit felt completely weightless. He reached up with a grease-stained, trembling hand and slowly wiped a thick streak of warm blood from his forehead. He looked directly into the primary security camera mounted above the shattered door, staring straight into the eyes of the terrified alien commander sitting safely, light years away. A harsh, defiant smile broke across Elias's exhausted, battered face. "Yeah, you are right," Elias answered, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying clarity through the open comms channel. "We are loud. We are messy. We are the noisy mechanics of this universe. And today, the whole universe is going to hear us sing." Over the open tactical channel, the cold, automated voice of the Dreadnought's targeting computer began its final, merciless countdown for the antimatter strike. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. The cold, mechanical countdown echoed through the open channel. At exactly 3 seconds remaining, Elias Buckley closed his eyes, drawing in a massive, ragged breath of the thin, freezing air. He did not input a complex binary override or recite a mathematical sequence. Instead, he opened his mouth and sang. He chose a simple, ancient earthfolk song, a melody passed down through countless generations of laborers, miners, and sailors who had worked their hands to the bone under the crushing weight of empires. The raw, unpolished timbre of his voice carried a rich, rustic frequency. His human vocal cords vibrated with a specific, chaotic biological warmth, generating the exact harmonic amplitude that the black zenith had been waiting for over the span of millions of years. The perfect resonance struck the floating crystalline lattice. The monolith did not merely react, it fully awakened. The soft blue light instantly exploded into a blinding, pure white incandescence. The black zenith unleashed a quantum acoustic shockwave that violently shattered the boundaries of real space, expanding outward at a velocity incomprehensible to standard physics, traveling millions of times faster than the speed of light. The wave hit the looming enemy fleet first. The sheer magnitude of the quantum vibration instantly disrupted the delicate particle oscillation stability within the Dreadnought's primary weapon cores. The catastrophic antimatter charging sequence was violently snuffed out, collapsing harmlessly into inert energy. Every single active system aboard the Kylan and Varathi warships suffered instantaneous, catastrophic acoustic dampening. Their engines died. Their weapons went cold. In the blink of an eye, the most terrifying military armada in the sector was reduced to a cluster of silent, powerless metal tombs drifting aimlessly in the orbital void. But the wave did not stop there. It violently swept across the entire Milky Way, singing a forgotten song to the stars. As the harmonic pulse washed over the galaxy, dormant cosmic infrastructure responded. Light burst forth from tens of thousands of ancient spatial fractures that had been sealed and forgotten for millennia. The original, infinite transit web violently tore itself free from the Alliance Council's artificial constraints. Brilliant rivers of quantum energy violently reconnected every isolated star system, painting a breathtaking, luminous map of absolute freedom across the dark expanse. The heavy, fortified transit gates controlled by the monopolies were instantly rendered completely obsolete. The universe was completely open once again. Riding directly atop that magnificent wave of light and sound was the architect's final payload. The undeniable, uncorrupted historical truth was broadcast directly into the minds of trillions of sentient beings simultaneously. It was not a digital file, but an empathetic pulse of pure memory. Every overworked miner, every starved colonist, and every oppressed citizen across 1,000,000 worlds felt the profound weight of the Council's grand deception. They saw the artificial scarcity. They felt the heavy chains of a fabricated history snapping all at once, in a single, unifying heartbeat. The absolute political and economic legitimacy of the ruling conglomerates completely evaporated into dust. Aboard the powerless dreadnoughts floating outside Elias's shattered workshop, the once arrogant commanders watched in sheer terror as their sensor grids flickered back to life, only to display an absolute nightmare for their regime. The newly opened slipstreams were already violently tearing open around the transit hub. Thousands of civilian freighters, retrofitted mining vessels, and jury-rigged interceptors belonging to the galaxy's forgotten and oppressed species began jumping through the liberated routes. Among them were hundreds of battered, heavily modified Earth defense ships. They were pouring into the sector in massive, overwhelming numbers, forming an impenetrable, chaotic armada entirely dedicated to protecting the lone human mechanic who had just handed them the keys to the universe. Faced with the furious, awakened might of a united underclass, the crippled Council fleet had no choice but to engage their emergency auxiliary thrusters and shamefully retreat into the dark. Inside the ruined, freezing workshop, the blinding light of the monolith slowly faded. The towering mass of the black Zenith gently retracted, folding its complex geometry inward until it shrank down to a single, warm, glowing crystal the size of a human fist, resting softly on the metal grating. Elias Buckley, the invisible acoustic engineer, who was completely ignored and laughed at during the auction, let out a long, shuddering sigh. His legs finally gave out, and he slumped down onto the debris-covered floor. He reached over to his overturned workbench, his trembling fingers wrapping around a dented steel thermos. He unscrewed the cap and took a slow, deliberate sip of completely cold, synthetic coffee. He closed his eyes, utilizing his cybernetic implant to listen beyond the ruined walls of his station. The oppressive, manufactured silence of the Council was gone forever. In its place was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of 1,000 different species traveling freely across the stars. The real war for the galaxy had only just begun. But as Elias smiled into the dark, he knew one absolute truth. Humanity was no longer just the noise in the machine. They were holding the conductor's baton. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our story today. We would love to know where you are listening to this story from, so please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's tale entertaining and meaningful, please consider helping us out with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link located in the video description or pinned comment. Your generous support is the only way our channel can afford to pay our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating better, more exciting stories to serve you.